All right, well, we got a few more people joining. All right. Well, again, my name is Portia Kipple-Smith. I am excited about our conversation today. And I know that over the last few months, fairness as well as inclusion, have been at the top of minds for all of us, not just around the tech industry, but quite honestly, all over the world. And people are once again taking a look at this and seeing the ways most companies hire software engineers and other high-paying skilled roles in tech as just completely broken. Many hiring systems are set up to really filter people out from different backgrounds rather than welcome them in. And that's why we have an issue with hiring and retaining, in my opinion, underrepresented minorities in tech. The good news is that at Karat, we help organizations improve the way they hire software engineers, specifically by making interviews more predictive, fair, and enjoyable. 3 years ago, I came up with this idea about real talk because I felt like in a room where we had underrepresented minorities, we could have a great conversation about how to make recruiting and hiring engineering more inclusive. But today, it's really taking on a new significance. Earlier this year, we shared our commitment to the Black community. What we did is we launched a $1 million practice interview program. And this initiative kicked off from organizations like Intern Hacks, as well as Howard University. And what we want to do is level the playing field by giving more Black software engineers access to the same types of resources and technical interview experiences that alumni from what I consider to be the traditional top computer science programs have access to. I think we all use events like Real Talk to make sure that we're listening to our community and understanding what having a fair and inclusive company feels like, while also learning what happens when businesses don't do that. They're not fair, they're not inclusive, they don't have the right cultures, and the impact that that has on Black employees. Our moderator and co-host this afternoon is Wahab Awalabi. Wahab is the founder of URX and a diversity business partner at Facebook. He sees the challenges we're talking about every day, as well as our panelists. Wahab, thank you so much for taking the time to help lead us in what today is our very first virtual edition of Real Talk Diversity in Tech. And thank you everyone for attending. Wahab, take it away.
Hey, Portia, thanks for that warm welcome. I'm really excited to be a part of this. This is, I've attended these in the past. I've been a panelist, and so I'm excited to be a moderator. Without further ado, I would love for our panelists to have an opportunity to introduce themselves. We're really blessed to have them join us today. And so if we can start with Roz, please let us know where you're joining us from and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. So my name is Roz Francis Harris. I'm actually joining from Seattle, Washington. I am the global head of direct-to-consumer technology talent acquisition for Warner Media. We're a global company, global media company. You might know some of our brands like Warner Brothers or HBO Max, CNN Digital, or Cartoon Network if you're like me and you still enjoy those. I've been in talent acquisition for 15 years, and I've been very blessed to where all of those years have been within the technology space. So thrilled to be a part of this conversation. Thank you, Wahab and Portia, for this forum to talk about these very important matters.
Rafael?
Hey everyone, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're calling from. Rafael Williams, Technical Recruiting Program Manager here at Twitter. Like Ross, my entire 8-year career in talent acquisition has been in tech, stemming from university recruitment to a little bit of industry, and now I'm a program manager where I ensure that I curate strategic experiences to attract underrepresented talent and how to get them here at Twitter.
Thanks. And Shala?
So my name is Shola. I'm a software engineer, senior software engineer working at IBM. I'm actually going to be starting as an OpenAI scholar in about a week. So I'm excited for that. Research in AI, and then I also do software engineering. So that's me. I'm right now in Maryland, so just outside of DC.
This is on your reality. We've got dogs barking in the background.
No.
So we're gonna kick it off with the first question. Charlotte, I'd love if you could just tell us a little bit about your experience. You have a new opportunity coming, but can you tell us about your background and your career to date and how you've managed that process as a software engineer and applying to multiple roles and deciding where you've taken your career?
Sure. So I think I'm just going to repeat the question a little bit. So I believe the first question was just around starting my career, getting involved in tech, and just a little bit of background. I'm from the Maryland area. I ended up going to Stanford. I studied computer science. And my first role in the industry was at Intuit. So a lot of love from Intuit. I think I saw someone on the call who works at Intuit. And it was really quite a hard process to honestly land my first role, both from the perspective of finding internships, but even finding a full-time role. I would essentially, I think at that time I applied to over 100 positions, and I would always get to the end round and would essentially be rejected because of culture fit. And at the time, I very much felt like, you're a great person, we know you could do the job, but because you're Black, we're not sure if you would fit in with us, so we're not going to hire you. And it was difficult because there's this element of, is it because I'm Black? Is it because I'm a woman? Because of the other aspect of how heavy sexism is in the tech industry in particular. Is it because I'm both at the same time? And so I think it, at least for me, was very difficult because it's also contrasted with, at least for similar graduates coming out of Stanford, um, it was a lot easier for my classmates to get into positions that I just I didn't have the opportunity to get in. And I think one of the things I appreciated at the time was there was a classmate of mine whom he was roommates with a Black guy, and both of them were CS. But he realized that while he got offers at everywhere, particularly a lot of startups, his roommate was getting zero offers, even though he acknowledged that his roommate was a better engineer. But because he was Black, the only offer he ended up getting, thankfully, was Google at the time. But it was even this idea, which is Google and Facebook being notoriously hard companies to get into, because they had sort of more established hiring practices, that was the only place he even would have a shot with, just because of some of the nuances around race and gender and such. And I think, at least for me, it just highlights, I think, just how difficult it can be. I think there is sometimes this narrative around people not being qualified enough, and I just haven't personally seen it in tech. Usually it's honestly that you need to be better than your classmates in order to get the same thing. And I think that is very tough to deal with. I think people don't tell you the process of not just proving yourself technically, but proving yourself in other spaces. So I know I've said a lot, so I'll stop here.
No, I think that you make a lot of good points, and people can learn from your experience. When we talk about Black tax and then the exhaustion, and Roz, I'm going to come to you with this. What I'm also hearing is you just don't know, right? So yourself as a software engineer, graduate from college, everybody around you from Stanford is having the red carpet rolled out for them, and you're trying to figure out, is there something with my skill set, or is there something else going on, and you can never really put your finger on it. Roz, you're a legend in the talent acquisition space. Yes, you are. How do we start to eliminate some of these biases? Because that's what's creeping into the process, especially with the great opportunities that startups and early stage tech companies can provide for their early software engineering employees.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Shola, thank you so much for sharing that very vulnerable story. I both wanted to to hug you and then go fight somebody as a result of hearing that, you know, and it's unfortunate, but her experience is the same experience of a lot of individuals that look like us in this space. And I think we know how we got here. I don't think the question of how we got here is even relevant anymore, but more so, what can we do about this to make sure that other people that look like you and I aren't feeling this way? And I think one of the things that TA professionals can do, because we truly do, we right at our fingertips, we have the access to all of these things. And it's taking a step back to look at how we are actually evaluating talent. How are we approaching talent? You know, Karat, this is actually like a little bit of a plug for Karat right there, because they actually make a tool that helps with some of this, eliminating some of these biases. You know, Byteboard is another one. And I think looking at our actual assessment, one thing that I do is remove people sometimes from this process. We're trying to evaluate technical skills for this particular example, right, of a software engineer. What's the point of me putting her on the phone with a hiring manager to evaluate if she's a cultural fit before we even know if she can code or not? Why? Right? And if you look at a lot of processes, that happens first. Or worse, someone that sits in the roles that we sit within in talent acquisition imply their own biases to this process, and she never makes it past the recruiter, right? So I think one of the things we need to first address is, what are we actually looking for, right? Cut the bullshit, and I'm gonna use that word, right? Just cut the crap. This is the technical skills we're looking for. My conversation with Shola as a recruiter needs to be about her technical skills. What is she looking for? And then we can talk about career trajectory. What has that experience been like for you? And then when I move that forward and say, Mr. or Mrs. Hiring Manager, I want to submit Shola to the next steps, there should be a conversation. It's great. Let's send her the assessment. And that needs to speak for itself. And so I think when we talk about these types of biases, look at your process. How many people am I talking to before you even know if I can do the job or not? And then, do you actually even know what the job is you want me to do? Because that's another thing that sounds so simple, right? We make these fluff job descriptions so that we have room sometimes to eliminate people, right? What's the actual job? And let's screen you to that. I think my philosophy on a lot of things when it comes to inequality is to stop hiring dickheads. And I say that, but if you cut poor middle management out, and we can actually talk about evaluating skill sets rather than people, will move a lot further faster on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, no, I mean, plus one to that. Rafael, I mean, you mentioned in your introduction, you've been in the space for 8 years, and I think you spent some time as well in the university recruiting area. And obviously you're a person of color. How do we balance our roles as, you know, Black talent acquisition professionals with being tasked with, you know, we'll get to today's current climate, but hey, go hire Black people for us, Black person on the team, maybe probably the only one?
So that's a twofold question. So I guess I will go with the latter half of that question. Number one, I think companies need to stop over pivoting or over indexing on Black employee resource groups to go out to attract individuals that look like them. When they do, they bring them into the organizations to mistreat them, or they are deceptive in the way they hire. And then secondly, as a talent acquisition professional, I'm very unapologetic about how I partner with my managers during the manager intake meeting. It's all about, like, I'm not here to deal with your shit. This is what you're gonna do. You're gonna stick to the candidate profile. And if I look at the data and at any point I see there's a drop off with your team because of the biases and your inability to screen in to tap into the talent and have more of a generalized profile, then we're yanking the rec and you don't need to hire. And so in the university recruiting space, however, I think companies over pivot in the top universities like UMich or Stanford or NYU and don't go to the schools that are more opportunistic to lean into the talent that they need to. And I think that is a really big miss for a lot of companies. And I think us as talent acquisition professionals, we have to lean into that, to go to some of the previews or the Spellmans, which might require a little bit more work in the interview process. But at the end of the day, you are diversifying your workforce. And that's how we as talent acquisitions can kind of lean in a little bit more. And it's tiring. because we get tired. We get tired of having to go out and advocate or even have to fight our internal stakeholders to even get individuals through the interview process. But I think we just have to continue that fight, because I always say we come as one, but we stand as 10,000. And it's a fight that we had to keep doing to get other people into the space.
Hey, well, I want to add one thing to what Rafael said, because he said it so quick, which was drop off. And I don't know if everyone knows what he means by that. But I think as people of color in talent acquisition, when someone comes to you and says like, hey, Roz, I want to talk to you about diversity and pipeline. I want to make sure that we've got a diverse pipeline. I actually chuckle, because I don't know one Black person who doesn't believe in a hookup. And what I mean by that is whenever we are somewhere, we're trying to constantly bring in others. So what I want to challenge TA partners to start to do is really track your slate versus the hiring decision. Because what that will then show, and it is beautiful when you actually can do it, because that drop-off rate that he's talking about, I'm giving you a diverse slate. You're choosing to hire 69% white men and 20% white women and 4% Black people, right? So let's talk about the decision-making mechanism that are going into place, because of your finalists, this is what they look like, right? And so I think when we start to get asked these questions, because the political climate is forcing companies to have some accountability into these metrics, understand there are parts of these that we actually don't control. And the parts that I do, I'm going to show you that not only am I giving you a diverse slate, you're choosing not to hire these folks. Now let's talk about that part of the process.
Yeah. No, I love it. And, we've got a couple of preset questions, but we're going to go off a script to see where this conversation takes us. I want to encourage everyone. We have a very active chat. Please, if you have questions for the panelists, I'm monitoring the chat, and I'll grab the questions from there and throw them to a panelist. A lot in those last two comments, I heard some questions around, what is performative DEI? What is performative DEI? In some of our earlier conversations, Roz, you've talked a little bit about setting folks up for success. What are we doing when we bring folks in? And Charlotte, I'd like to bring it back to you. And just to maybe take a little bit of a pivot, what are some experiences that you've had at some companies where you felt as though being hired into the company, you were hired in a way that was said, hey, look, we think you're great. We want you to come in here, and we want to set you up for success. And frankly, if you're comfortable, we'd love for you to also share some experiences that maybe were the opposite, where you weren't necessarily set up for success as a minority software engineer.
I think that honestly, thankfully, I've had more positive experiences, but I also think that part of the reason I've had positive experiences is because I haven't gone to some of our favorite tech companies, just because of the ways in which I didn't feel like it was conducive to the type of trajectory, the development that I wanted for my career. And I think that's a trade-off that I think a lot of recruiters sometimes don't understand. Sometimes we don't choose to go to sort of the top tech company, and it's not necessarily always because we can't. Sometimes there's an element of that place mentally is not good for me. That place, it will be the type of place where my mentor or the person who's supposed to shepherd me in my career won't do that. And so, I really looked very favorably on Intuit. I loved my time there. I thought that my mentors and the people who worked for me were very fantastic. And actually, my engineering manager did my recommendation for my grad school. And so I think having people who really believe in you, who are willing to invest in you, and I think really taking you under your wing, I think that is so important from a career perspective. Even having people 5 to 10 years out from where you are, who aren't trying to replicate their experience in your life, but are listening to you and what you need, what your career looks like, and helping you to see more of the options using their experience. I think that has been very positive for me. I also think being positioned as an authority in my craft. I'm a software engineer, and I think that sometimes when we have a conversation of diversity, sometimes it's framed as charity. And I think what gets lost on is that these people are talented, and that you're leaving talent and capability off the table because because of sort of the political nature of just the way sometimes we discuss race. And I think that like putting the focus back on like, not necessarily setting you up as sort of the Black person, but setting you up as like the best engineer we have or the engineer that I want to be the best. I think that has been very formative, and people who don't necessarily ignore the race or the gender, but who factor those in, but still really just want the best for me, that I think has been very transformative. On the opposite side, I think some of the probably the worst experiences were probably connected to people who made assumptions about my capability. I'll give a really short example. I applied for a company that I'm sure everyone here knows, and I had the interview, my first and second round, with the recruiter, which was great, and with the engineering manager, which was great. But when I had my first video interview, it was two people interviewing me. And the one guy essentially spent the whole video sort of talking down on me. I answered everything correct, everything went well. By the end of the interview, he essentially said, oh, this must be too easy if you're able to get it correct. He then goes on to essentially ask about a program called Code 2040, which is a program for Black and Latino engineers, and then goes on to talk about how he would never want someone from Code 2040 and how he'd never want anyone who's Black or Latino working at his company. And this was just an employee of a team that I would be joining. He wasn't even necessarily going to be my manager. And so I guess I'm framing that because of, I think it's different in every industry, but I think sometimes because of the lack of, I think, social etiquette engineers can have, there are ways in which you can very just legitimately be faced with someone who is essentially like, you know, I don't want, not only do I not want to support your career, but I intentionally might want to derail it just because of my own sort of ignorant thoughts on who I think you are. It's a very real experience, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I would run for the hills, right? Like, I mean, I can't imagine anybody who would go through that experience and walk away thinking, they'd want to work at a company like that.
And I think to expand on that point, I actually think that's what recruiters miss, is that sometimes I think there's this idea of like, diversify the pipeline, the pipeline, the pipeline. And I would actually argue not only is the talent there, but there isn't enough vetting out of the non-minority talent. I think there is this idea that like minorities need to be fixed instead of this idea that like you want all your employees to have certain values, and if any of your employees exhibit certain values, it jeopardizes the whole team. So I look back at that company and I actually think back to my conversation with the hiring manager, with the HR. All of them were fantastic. The engineering manager was great. Even my conversation with him, he gave me praise. He was very great. He was even formulating potentially how he would want my career to look like. But that was derailed by one person on the team who very ignorantly said, I don't want to work with anyone who looks like you. And I think the problem is not just him, but the fact that the people around him didn't condone it. Because what it said was that that's okay to be here and that his presence was more important than mine. And I think people don't necessarily realize, particularly those who are in higher positions where they can hire, how the ways in which they don't vet the values of everyone walking through the door jeopardizes everyone, but particularly minorities, as far as the experience. Because not only would I not want to join a company like that, I wouldn't recommend it for friends of mine, particularly in engineering. And then even if I were to join, I wouldn't stay long. And so it sort of perpetuates this problem. But that's the negative side. I look at a company like Intuit, and I've had the completely opposite experience. So it unfortunately can be a very hit or miss.
Yeah. I mean, what I think what we're starting to talk about, and I saw a question from the chat, is accountability as well, at all levels of this conversation. And so, Rafael, you actually started to touch on this, which I thought was a great point around holding hiring managers accountable with that intake meeting. Can you speak a little bit more about how you've held interviewers accountable, hiring managers, and how that might translate to more success in creating an equitable interview process. And I'm going to come to you, Roz, next in terms of how can we hold our executives accountable, or at least bring them in to this process. Rafael?
So I think it's a mixture of both. So first, we need to get that candidate feedback so we can go back and definitely have that raw, authentic conversations with our hiring partners on the experience of what someone had. So this new generation, for sure, in the university space, are definitely willing to come back and let you know how their experience were in the interview process. And you're able to go to those hiring managers or those teams to be unapologetic about being like, hey, you jacked up and this is why you jacked up. And so we're not giving those offers. But also making sure they have those unconscious bias trainings. Granted, I think unconscious bias training is bullcrap because you know what your biases are. So you go into those interviews with that level of, I'm not going to hire this person. But it's also what, as a recruiting partner, what are you pouring into that team? How are you educating that team on DEI efforts and moving things forward? And vetting them out is just, as I said earlier, is that data and holding them to the fire and consistently with that feedback that you're getting back. And I always ask candidates, if they drop off as a diverse candidate, why did you drop off? What happened during the interview process? What was wrong? And so I can go back and have that 360 loop with the team.
That's awesome.
One thing that, and it's funny, I've been doing a lot of discovery this week, and it absolutely taps into what Shola just described. What I'm finding is that at the executive level, I'm not having an issue with accountability in terms of them saying that this is a commitment, they're making it, putting funds behind it, putting resources behind it. Where I'm finding that we have opportunity as an industry is how well we trickle that commitment down through the rest of the organization to the interviewers who are going to be on the loop. In lots of engineering interviews, sometimes they'll have a cross-functional partner from product or from design come over to that loop. And has it been communicated to that person that this is a priority for our org? And then what I'm finding too is that when we have these problematic viewpoints, such as, I don't really think there's value in hiring someone from Code 2040, for example, who's condemning that person and saying, that's not okay, that's a problem, and until you've gone through some training and development, we're gonna take you off interview loops. Because what's end up happening is you're creating this like subculture. You have these values that you posted on your website, you have these values that we're supposedly screening people to, but you have no preference to the subculture that has been created. And to Shola's point, it's largely in engineering organizations. And I mean, I don't like to say it's because engineers have different etiquette.
It's true. It's true. You can say it's true.
You can say it because you're an engineer, so I'll let you say that.
Ross still got to hire some engineers over there.
But what I will say is the priorities are different. Like, I spend every day talking to people. So I have a heightened to, like, social acceptable things to say, or like body language, or what pronouns to use. Engineers spend most of their time coding, and they're very matter of fact. And so when it's time for me to look up and say something to you, I'm going to tell you what's on my mind so I can get back to coding, right? And that's the piece that we've got to become more in tune with when we are HR partners and diversity partners, even TA partners. We need to know who we're putting on these loops to evaluate talents, whether it's diverse talent or white talent, because we're letting bullshit slide that shouldn't. So I think the accountability, while I do love holding execs accountable, I'm all about it. Bonus them, take the pay, do all the good things when it comes to executives. But I think there's more that we could be doing throughout middle management and the interview panels to ensure this sort of fairness and consistency is actually happening in the interview process.
Ross, I want to add on to that. I think that we use the engineering subculture as a BS way to excuse the white engineers during the interview process and allowing them to do a lot of dismissing, et cetera, because they want to be straightforward or want to be their subculture. But I always challenge them to use their white privilege. Like, are you listening? Are you actively listening to your interviewees when they're there? Are you actively dialing in? Or are you just doing this as I gotta be here, or I must have this interview? So I challenge engineers, if there are any on the call, pick your head up and have that level of empathy for others and listen to others, and stop trying to feel like you need to have the engineering excuse of this is the way things are because we're engineers.
I want to add on to that. I also want to add on to the fact that in engineering hiring and a lot of engineering decisions are made unanimously. So all you need is one person to dissent and you get rejected. And that's particularly true at almost all the big companies like Google, Facebook, et cetera. And so that really poses a challenge because if you have one person who may have stereotypes or bias, you can score perfectly on the interview and you won't get the position. And I think one short story I have around this was actually working at Intuit. I was part of a hiring crew where we were hiring for interns, and there was a young Latina woman who was in the interview lines, and one of the guys, he was just very ambivalent on her. He was like, I think she has a lot of potential, but I don't know. And he was leaning no, but he hadn't actually said anything that would sort of say that we shouldn't hire her. He just didn't seem super excited about her. And I think, at least for me, maybe because of sort of the empathy around me just being able to recognize, like, because she may not look like his image of what like a younger engineer would look like, he just is not thinking beyond like, I guess she's all right. When I just asked more and I said, okay, well, what's wrong? What happened in the interview? He was like, actually nothing. I mean, she just interviewed great. It seems like she has a lot of potential. And I was like, well, this is an intern role. We hire interns with potential. So, what you're all saying marks what we would be looking for. Is there anything that would say otherwise? And really, he couldn't. And I think even me just asking that question and ended up flipping him from a neutral sort of ambivalent position to actually, you're right, this is a student position. Why would I expect anything other than potential? Like, these are students. And I think me even just saying that without necessarily, I didn't attack him. I didn't say like, oh, you're being biased. I just posing a question almost made him think like, I don't even know why I didn't connect that. And as soon as I said that, he advocated for her. She got the position and she's been at Intuit for several years now. And I think about that in terms of, we think that sometimes it's big things that we have to do to change, and sometimes it can even be small things. And I think going back to, I'm sorry, I forgot who said it earlier, but just at least with interviewing, it needs to be around the technical. And when I really pointed out the technical, that's when we realized that actually everything is solid. There is no reason actually, there is no sort of negative here, so we're going to do it. And she's been highly successful since then. And so I think about that as just an example of how easy it is to change. And something like that, it sounds small, but that internship, I think she's been at the company for several years now. And so I just think about that there's just so many people on the cusp of like having that opportunity in their career that I feel like just being a little bit more mindful, we can make tremendous difference.
Well, you're spot on, right? I mean, so that first internship leads to the next one, which is the reason why somebody might get the opportunity for the amazing full-time job. So you're spot on. Before we shift gears a little bit, we have a question from the chat that I'd like to throw to the group and get your thoughts on this. So this is from an anonymous attendee. As a leader, I'm absolutely appalled at the comments of the team members surrounding not wanting to work with someone who is Black or a Black female in particular. My gut instinct is that I would fire that person, but I wonder if you all think that's the right solution.
I mean, I'm biased. I would absolutely say it's the right solution. But what I do want to add to the question is, as the leader, the question then is posed, what did you do to allow this to happen in your org, right? How did you get an individual on your team who felt this way? And that's what I mean by like, and I think, Shola, you nailed it when you say, we screen minorities so heavily on culture to make sure that they fit the culture that we just kind of omit that for non-people of color. And so it's holding that same standard to everyone across the board and not making this assumption that people of color need to be fixed in order to fit into this. So when you it is appalling, and that person should have absolutely been fired. But the more important question that I would ask is, how did they get here? How did they get through the process to be able to work here and we not know that this is something they think about? Or how are and to Shola's point, there was someone else in that room. There was someone else in that room who said nothing.
Yeah, and I love what you said. I think everything you're saying is spot on. I think it really goes to, ironically, the culture of the environment. And I think what's better than even the firing, because the firing is just sort of the one instance, but I think for me, what I see in tech is that there lacks of professionalism um, in the engineering cultures that I think is very different from maybe sort of established like finance companies and other industries. And I think it's in part because in crafting culture, especially with a lot of the big tech companies, anti-racism wasn't included in that culture. And I think that's a sort of bigger issue that companies don't own as far as when they really think about their culture. There's this element of like, diversity is sort of seen as a separate issue as opposed to this idea of if we really have a company and a culture that is, against racism, against sexism, and is really truly open, um, when the pipeline comes, we'll be able to foster that growth within our company. And I think what companies are actually realizing is that growth, not only is that growth not fostered, but when people do, diverse talent does come, they leave in part because these things they don't exist. But I will say that despite, I think, what can sound like negative, because we're talking real today, there are also, I would say, unexpected places that I feel like have been home to, have been places where I think people have been really able to support diverse talent. I mentioned Intuit for me personally was a place like that. I know Slack has been a place like that for a lot of my friends, companies that have really made a commitment to diversity, and it shows throughout the platform. I think MailChimp is another example of an engineering company that fosters that growth. So these companies are there and they're strong, but I think it's also communicating out there so people don't feel like having a career in engineering means that they won't have access to coworkers who respect them and things like that. It's there.
So, this is real talk, and I feel like Portia won't ask me back if we didn't actually get into some things that are going on in the world today. So just in the last, I would say, 2 or 3 weeks, we've had the CEO of a major financial company say that there aren't enough talented black folks to work in his company. We've recently had another major tech company essentially say that they're going to be on the sidelines of a conversation around being anti-racist or taking a stand against injustice. And the direction I want to take this in, and I'm going to come to you, Rafael, is how hard does this make your job? If you're one of these folks working in recruiting, white, black, or other, when your leadership is laying down these type of statements in public.
Am I still working there? I think it makes it hard because we as Black employees already we're dealing with Black tax, we're dealing with the current Black exhaustion, we're dealing with working while Black, some of us have to code switch in order to sit in different environments. And so having to also challenge the status quo, already having to educate people on how to interview, how to bring people in, it's exhausting, man. And I think it is just not a value add when we have those level of PR initiatives come out, because diversity starts from the top down. I was at Microsoft, and diversity literally comes from Satya all the way down, even though it kind of like mess with his pay if he doesn't have diversity initiatives. But he actually really does believe in that and pushes it down and ensure that they have initiatives for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so when it's not coming from the top down, just like America, now they allow individuals within their organization, within our country, to be racist, to be blatantly racist and be unapologetic about it because it comes from the top down. And so it makes my job 12 times harder to have to come back that. Sorry, I know I probably shouldn't have said that, but I did.
It was perfect. I just want to add, and y'all are a lot more courteous than I am, but I'm going to actually use the company name as Wells Fargo, because we all saw it. It was all over LinkedIn. It was all over Twitter. And I remember the first time I saw it, I thought, to be a Black recruiter at Wells Fargo today, and I know some of those people, there are some great recruiters at Wells Fargo. And I thought, damn, their job just got made really hard. And it was and I'm not going to say it was a miscommunication or he misspoke, but it was an unfortunate event because this is a company that literally has had over a century. Let's just say theoretically, what the CEO said was correct, and there is no pipeline of Black talent. Theoretically, he's correct. You've literally had over a century to build a pipeline of Black talent. You've literally had over a century to build internal programs that can foster promotion, development, retention, community relations, and so let's just say that some of these things people are saying are correct. Then that's going to pose the next question as a professional is, what are you doing about it? Now, we know that wasn't real and it was devastating. And so one thing that I will say is like recruiters who we're going to be victims to it. And unfortunately, we all can't just quit our jobs because our CEO says something dumb that doesn't reflect who we are. I wish we could. But what we then have to do is sort of change the narrative, right? We have to have internal conversations with our leadership. And I hope that you all feel empowered to do that in your roles. And if not, that's where that great anti-racist coworker of yours needs to step in and be that voice for us. So to all the allies on the call who don't look like me, this is when your voice is needed. I hope every white employee at Wells Fargo sent their CEO an email that day and said, you're wrong, and you're wrong. And here's how I know you're wrong, right? And so that's where I mean by like the accountability, it's gotta be on more people other than Black people to have this conversation. And what Wells Fargo did, and listen, they're not the only one. We can literally name every company that we all work for at some point that has had something like this happen. And so that's where it's not the D&I team's responsibility to spin this and make it something better, but it's the internal OD, learning development, comms, PR, everybody coming together to say, this is not who we are. We can do better. And since you've made this statement, now what are we going to do about it? How are we going to create pipeline or engagement activities to foster development and retention of this community?
Yeah. No.
Yeah, I think I want to add to that.
Charlotte, yeah, actually, go ahead, Charlotte, please.
Yeah, and sorry for my lighting, guys. It got dark here, but I wanted to add to that because I want to co-sign her point around this idea of sort of the diversity pipeline and really having the time to build it and not fostering it. I honestly feel like pipeline is kind of an excuse that people use just not to hire Black talent, in part because the talent that is offered isn't hired. And from what I've seen, when Black talent does get hired, they usually have way more accomplishments than their peers. And that to me is a problem. I just find that like there's this idea that sort of the standard is here and Black people or minorities are here, when what I've really seen is to get hired, the threshold for everyone is here, and the threshold when you're Black is here. And that's the problem. And I think for me, particularly just hearing this thoughts, I really struggle. He's in finance, but I struggle particularly because I hear this a lot in tech. People say, oh, I don't know how to solve diversity. We can solve self-driving cars and we can, make robots that go rockets that go to the moon, but we can't solve diversity. And I think I really struggle with this because I think about being in your lane of expertise. You hire experts to be able to solve functions in relation to what you want to get solved. And I think my issue with diversity is that it's often, the people often in a position to work on this are not usually they do not usually have the expertise. And I think for me, not leaning on people of color, not leaning on people who have academically studied this, people who really put their neck out, people who understand systems, I think that you can't say you haven't been able to solve this if you haven't put the money, the time, and the expertise to this problem. And I think for me, that is probably the most difficult piece about this idea around we can't do it, is that you haven't actually tried. So how do you know you can't do this thing? And particularly because I know that you're a shrewd businessman, you know how to do this in every other space. Why is it you just have this difficulty with diversity? And so it makes me feel more so that it's not that you can't do it, you don't want to do it, you don't want to spend to do it. And I think what's so sad, very much like was just mentioned, is you've had 100 years. Like I look at tech, people say it's a small field, but we've had at least 10 years so far. You could have hired literally 2 Black people, 5 Black people a year, and your numbers would be better than what they look like today. That's a problem. That's a problem. 5 Black people a year, 5 women a year for the last 10 years, and your numbers would look better than what you have. And I think that's like, we think that it needs to be these grand gestures. And I think for me, I just feel like corporations and people need to just really take accountability.
Yeah. I mean, do we drop the mic? I mean, I'm not sure where we go from there.
The self-restraint it took for me not to scream when she was saying all that, because she hit it on the head so nicely, so eloquently. And I think it puts the ball back in the court of how serious the corporations and the industry is about changing this. We can talk about this till we blue in the face, but what are you going to do about it? What resources, what money, what? And it's funny, I get this question, Wahab, all the time, like, Roz, why don't you go into a D&I role? I'm just Black, first of all. I'm just a lesbian who happens to be Black, but my area of expertise is talent acquisition. And if you move me into that role, sure, I can learn some things, but I'm not an expert there. There are people who, as Shola mentioned, who study this, who have put years into this craft. But yet we find very few of them in the positions to actually add the change that we need to see, because companies aren't opening the roles at those levels. They're not paying that money. They're not investing in those tools. They're just not.
Well, I mean, I think something that we can center here is this, still going back to this conversation around performative, what are these gestures, and what's actually going to make an impact. And one of the things themes I think I've heard today so far is, if you're not investing time and or money into this, whatever else you do, your statements and all that stuff, really don't matter, right? And so when I think about some of the points that Shala is making, and I want to go to Rafael with this, how have you seen companies successfully invest time and money into programs, into cultivating relationships, communities, maybe tools and products that have led to some success and increase in representation?
So I know of a few companies that have done really cool things about like looking at, I know like non-traditional backgrounds. So going to coding schools, going to boot camps that are centered around non-diverse talent, not just going to pluck the talent, but also giving scholarships or resources to help individuals be able to pay their way through those boot camps. Google, for example, is doing a really cool job where also they are doing scholarships for different IT backgrounds. So the IT certificate or the product management or data analysis. And so I think they're walking the walk and talking the talk, because some of those individuals don't have to have a bachelor's degree to go into those level of scholarships. And so I think that is one of the really cool ways that they need to dial in and kind of doing that and putting that money where it actually is, and moving from that performative. That's what I've actually seen. I know Twitter. I know we see Jack a lot throwing money out a lot at the community, at ODSD, et cetera, et cetera. But internally, we're doing a lot of internal work to ensure that we have the resources and to bring diverse talent in and to keep it and retain it and educate it. And give them a place to have a voice. Now we're doing a mentorship program internally where Black, brown, women, et cetera, can move up to be leaders instead of being the ICs, because we don't see them as leaders. And so I think that's what I've seen so far throughout my career.
I want to add to a couple of performative and non-performative things that we've seen too recently, because we've seen a lot, boy. We've seen a lot recently. I would say another company that has changed something, shout out to Lyft and shout out to Dropbox. They both, in certain pockets, implemented this tool called Byteboard. And it is one of those tools, very much like Karat, that kind of like peels back that assessment process to remove biases from it. And they immediately started to see a change in how many women and how many people of color were making it to that finalist round, and then were eventually getting hired. And you all know it's changed the landscape of how those companies are looking. I remember earlier I saw the delete Uber if you are racist billboards. I don't know if you all saw those billboards, and I was like, oh, that's cute, that's nice. But then I fast forward a little bit more and saw them remove all fees on Uber Eats for Black-owned restaurants, and that's where I'm like, okay, that's what I'm talking about. That's making an impact to the community. That's not performative. That's true allyship and supporting the Black community. So I think it's watching the company as they go from that, you know, at one point in time, everybody changed their Instagram to the we stand with the Black community or we support the Black community. But it was what came after that that actually added equity into a process or into the community or into your consumer base that allow African Americans or Black and Latin professionals or consumers some sort of access to it that wasn't tied to just a hashtag, you know? Subsidizing a part of your product for low-income housing. Things like that that actually make an impact to the community have been really good to see.
Yeah. I want to say I don't want to stretch this too much, but would it be fair to say that, you know, as like just being a part of the Black community, I think we're very like, you know, we support each other. It's like it takes a village. That mindset of, hey, it takes a village, and I think it means something to folks when they see your company doing these things that are actually making an impact. And frankly, it helps your brand and it inspires people to want to work for you, right? Want to work for a company. Is that fair to say? Is that, I mean, I don't know is there something that we've experienced or am I off base?
Can I tag on to what was just said? I wanted to also just clarify, I think, where we are. I think that people don't realize that I think it's been true for a lot of oppressed groups. So this is women to some extent, Black people, Latinx. From a certain extent, the way institutions were traditionally structured, it has excluded people of color and people from really even being a part of the conversation. And so when I think about media, for example, being excluded from advertising dollars meant that Black media and media that sort of served these different subgroups couldn't grow past a certain level due to that exclusion. Similarly, in tech, that sort of exclusion has limited sometimes the career and the progression of certain people. Technology has radically changed that. We see it in music with ways in which artists have been able to just bypass record labels who used to be the gatekeepers of who was going to get the record deal, who was going to become famous. Technology has completely changed that. And I think what's actually going to happen is previously you could deny talent regardless of what community it was a part of, or you could deny talent based off of community because you had the power to do so. That power is slipping and that power is changing. And so when you sort of deny talent from your company, I think what we're going to see within the next 10 to 20 years is that those companies that keep that exclusive energy will just be denied from having bigger talent pools and being able to be as creative and as innovative as their competitors. And I think what we're actually going to see is them being left behind. Because previously it was possible for you to do that because everyone is excluding. When one or two companies take a hard stance, and that is the Wells Fargo, the Coinbase, they take that stance and they make a home that excludes others. They really put themselves in a position that will make them less competitive to the other people who not only have their doors open, but also ways in which tech is democratizing and completely even putting them out of sphere. So I sort of don't want this conversation to be completely morbid or for people to think that, you know, sort of everything is doom and gloom. I actually think the opposite, which is those who really embrace diversity and those who really embrace the anti-racist or the anti-sort of sexist approach are actually going to be the winners. And I think right now what we're seeing and even sort of that dichotomy that's happening, that sort of equity is shifting. And I think, I'm not sure if people see it right now, but I just want to say within the next 10 years or so, I think some of the problems that we used to see, which is if you're a member of a certain group or a certain gender, you couldn't go past this, that's not happening anymore.
I think it'll be shorter than 10 years. I think you nailed it. I think we'll see that impact a lot sooner, and we're feeling it now. because we have the ability. Consumers have a lot more control
Yes.
over things that we didn't have control over before. And with one tweet, you can say goodbye to your fourth quarter earnings. And so it definitely, you're spot on. It has changed. It has changed the layout. It has changed the makeup. And you'll see. And this story I went to with Tiana Mayberry, she got married. Tiana Mayberry, who is a recruiter over at Lyft, talked about a candidate who was a woman and was not going to interview because there weren't other women on her panel. And this candidate was able to dictate who was going to interview her, and they reassembled the panel for her, and now she's working there and she's doing great. But it's that kind of power that we now have just by saying things, and especially in public forums. It's crazy. I look forward to see how that changes, but I don't think it's going to take 10 years. I think we'll see it a lot faster.
Yeah, we need to see it a lot faster.
And I want to go back to your previous statement about like it takes a community and like ad dollars, etc. I want to caution people from like, amazing, I love the billboards, I love the CEOs donating money, etc. But do your research before you go and actively apply for these companies or interview for these companies or accept an offer, because sometimes people do things for show and essentially aren't actually care for the well-being of their Black employees. So I think right now during these times have really, really highlighted how companies really treat their Black and brown employees. So find out what resources they have during these times to find out how are we pouring into your mental health? Are we giving you therapy resources in order to kind of go over with like the current hashtags? So I just really want to let people know being more performative and being a little bit more active with their employees.
Yeah.
I think those are all justifiable questions to ask. And Roz, I know we're a little bit over time. And so what I'd love to do is actually give each panelist an opportunity to share some last thoughts on a very open prompt, which is what gives you hope? I think, Charlotte, I think you kind of kicked us off on this. And so Roz, like, what are the things that you're seeing? What gives you hope as we move forward?
Great question. What gives me hope? I mean, sometimes it's going to say like reality actually gives me hope. And what I mean by that is, especially when we talk about our jobs and the companies that we work in, like it's wild to assume that the issues that the rest that we face in this country are going to be excluded from our workplace, right? So the same things that we go through every day in America seep into the walls of where we work. But, change comes just like technology. There's ebbs and flows to the political life cycle. There's these ebbs and flows to economic life cycles. And so what gives me hope is knowing that and thinking to the future, seeing the work that we all do in our little corners of the corporations that we serve, and knowing that every person that we touch, it passes on and it passes on and it passes on and it passes on. So knowing that there's going to be another cycle, going to change, and this is just a moment that we have to bear down and come together and work on a problem together. It really gives me hope to keep going.
Awesome. Thanks. Rafael?
So I have to go back to my UR roots. I think the new generation gives us hope. In a minute, they will be inundating the new workforce and definitely changing. I think they are very unapologetic about inclusion, diversity, equity, and speaking up and having a voice and leaning in. And as Ross talked about earlier, as one of the interviewers, I know a UR person wanted one of her interviewers, she didn't see a male on the loop, so she didn't come to interview. So she wanted to make sure that it happened. So I think that is really going to change the way we think about our products and services, and also how we think about the talent attraction. And that's what I'm happy about, because I see it consistently that they are blasting people out for ill hiring practices, and they are unapologetic about it, especially on LinkedIn. I don't know if you've seen some of those like really like racy like LinkedIn posts, but it's going to help us change the way we talent attract. And we scope our job descriptions to make sure that they are non-binary and really cool ways. So I'm very, very hopeful with that aspect alone.
Thanks. And Charlotte, I'd love to give you the last word.
Oh, nice, awesome. So I think part of this hope sort of expands upon what I said earlier. I think for me, what really just gives me hope is how quickly it's shifting. I feel like we're in a position where I'm seeing sort of ways in which people used to be limited before, those sort of like chains, the struggle. It's becoming non-factors these days. And what's more than that is I also do feel like this has been a problem, but I don't think that people, particularly outside the silos community, really understood the extent of what people were dealing with. And I kind of feel like in the more recent years, particularly this year, the lid has really been blown off of it. And I think what I've been very worried by is really seeing some of my colleagues and people who I'm in the community with who may have been these silent factors realizing that they've chosen not to be silent anymore. They've chosen to be a part of the conversation and then to actively help and to actively begin to move as a unity in the right direction. And so I think for me, I'm very optimistic. I would encourage people to get in a position to apply for the jobs, to reach out to people for mentorship, to really even diversify your network beyond what your community is. So if you're Black, going across race, if you're a woman, making sure you have mentors that are both male and female. I'm really seeing, as divisive as these times are, I'm really seeing a lot of unity. And I think for me, that's really hopeful.
Well said. Well, I want to thank each of you for spending this time with myself and with everybody that's on the call. I want to thank Portia and the Karat team for creating this space and lending this space to us to have this conversation. I know that Karat has a lot of great initiatives around this area and this arena. The Portia, you mentioned the $1 million practice interviewing initiative, and I believe that there are ways for other companies who would be interested in participating in that. And that I would describe as not performative. And maybe, Portia, you can share how they can get in touch with you or get in touch with the team, and then we can sign off.
Okay, absolutely. I'd love for you to reach out to me because I do believe when Rafael talked about, what gives him hope, it was really about the young people. And it's the young people that I'm working with every day at Howard University when I'm going into the classrooms in the computer science departments and seeing the people who are going through the data structures class, the seniors, where quite honestly, 30% of them only have job offers, 70% of them don't have a job offer. We have got to do something to level the playing field. And we, Karat, have stepped up to the plate to say, we want to give you practice interviews. We want to help you become the person that you want to be because we know that there's inequity out there. So when we talk about the access gap, there is a huge gap, especially from even earnings power. So we want to ask other people if you're interested in joining us on this quest. We not only want to do it at Howard University, but we want to do this at other HBCUs and reach out to other students of color, especially African American and Latinx, who have the desire, who are in those classrooms that are saying, maybe I don't belong here. So they need to see people who look just like them to encourage them to say, there is a path, there is a road to success, and I want to help you get there. So I appreciate, number one, Karat giving us the opportunity to have real talk today, and for Karat giving Howard University also being an advocate at Howard and giving us the opportunity. So I'll put my email in the chat, and by all means, please reach out to me because we're doing something special that nobody else has done. And the students are loving the whole idea that, I call it mama tips because I'm in the classroom with them, that they are enjoying hearing from someone who quite honestly has spent their whole career in tech. I don't apologize, but I will tell you that I started in the 70s at Xerox when we went from small copiers, actually from large copiers to desktop copiers. I was at IBM when we launched our first personal computer. I was at Sprint when we launched our first cell phones. And now I'm at Karat, and we're doing something transformative as well. So everywhere I go, everywhere I touch, look out, it's something big that's going to happen.
Hey, I love it. I love it. Portia's got the Midas touch, and we're in a moment in time in history where whether or not our generation reaps the benefits, to Rafael's point, and we want to pay it forward for those that are coming behind us. And maybe the last thing I'll just share is, for those in the call, we centered this conversation around the Black experience. There's a lot of intersectionality in terms of what's going on in the world, so I want to definitely acknowledge that. And I want to encourage everybody to make sure that you are investing just as much in your tried and true talent pools as much as you are in developing new ones, and going and making sure that you're being equitable in how you're going out there and trying to attract your talent. With that, thank you for spending this time with us today. And Portia and team, look forward to the next one.
Yes, we will have the next Real Talk.